You are mine now. The words were not a question, but a declaration, hard and final as the frozen earth. They were spoken into a wind that howled like a wounded beast, slicing across the opulent but neglected grounds of the Thorn estate. Calen stood on the porch, a figure carved from mountain, rock and shadow, his gaze fixed on the man before him. Master Thorn, his face flurried with drink and rage, clutched a riding crop, its leather tip stained dark. Between them, huddled on the frost-slicked floorboards, was a woman. Her name was Elara, though Calen did not know it yet. He knew only the ruin of her face, the bruises blooming violet and black across her skin, and the way she curled herself protectively around 3 small, wailing bundles wrapped in rags. The sight had stopped Calen in his tracks when he'd arrived to trade furs. He had heard the screams from the road, a sound that grated against the deep quiet he carried within him. Now, he saw the source. Thorn laughed, a crackling, ugly sound. Yours? She is property. My property. She defied me, giving birth to this litter. Useless mouths. He gestured with the crop toward the infants, his lip curling in disgust. Calen didn't move. He didn't blink. His hand rested on the handle of the axe tucked into his belt, a tool for felling trees that looked, in that moment, like a weapon of grim justice. I will pay you for her. Thorn's eyes glinted with avarice, but his pride was a sharper spur. She is not for sale. Calen's gaze shifted from Thorn to the woman. Her eyes, wide with terror, met his for a fleeting second. In their depths, he saw not a broken thing, but a desperate, cornered fire. I am not asking to buy, Calen said, his voice low and resonant as shifting stone. I am telling you. She and the children are coming with me. He took a single, deliberate step forward, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the violence that was sure to follow. The journey was a crucible of ice and silence. Calen had bundled the woman and her 3 infants into the back of his wagon, piling his traded furs and unsold pelts around them as a shield against the biting wind. He had thrown a heavy gold coin onto the porch at Thorn's feet, a gesture not of purchase but of contempt, before turning his back on the sputtering man. Now, the estate was miles behind them, a bad memory swallowed by the endless white of the plains. Elara was a ghost in the wagon, a silent shape of pain. She did not speak, did not weep. Her entire being was focused on the 3 impossibly small lives she held, tucking the furs tighter around them, breathing her own warmth into their swaddling. Her body screamed with a pain that was a living thing, but her children's survival was the only prayer she had left. Calen drove the horses with a steady, relentless hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. The landscape was a merciless expanse of white, the sky a sheet of pewter. To him, this was home. This brutal, beautiful emptiness was the one thing he understood. Every gust of wind, every crunch of snow beneath the wagon wheels, was a familiar language. He could feel her fear radiating from the back of the wagon, a palpable force as sharp as the cold. He knew what men like Thorn were, what they did. He had seen it before, in other places, in a life he had left behind. He pushed the horses harder, racing the setting sun. Just as the last vestiges of light bled from the sky, a plume of smoke became visible against the dark line of the distant mountains. A single light, small and defiant, flickered in the encroaching dark. It was his cabin. It was refuge. He carried her inside. She weighed almost nothing, a fragile collection of bones and hurt. The triplets he brought in one by one, their tiny, unheard protests muffled by their wrappings, and laid them in a careful row near the hearth. The cabin was a single room, built of sturdy pine, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and cedar. A fire roared in the stone fireplace, a stark and vibrant contrast to the desolate cold outside. It was the heart of this place, and Calen immediately stoked it, sending a shower of sparks rising like frantic fireflies. Elara had stumbled to the far corner, her back against the rough-hewn logs, watching his every move with the wariness of a hunted animal. Her eyes were vast pools of terror, reflecting the firelight. He expected her to flinch when he approached, and she did, a tremor running through her thin frame. He stopped, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. He set a bowl of water and a clean rag on the floor a few feet away from her, then retreated to the other side of the room. He said nothing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the sigh of the wind outside the sturdy walls. He worked methodically, taking a pot from a hook and filling it with snow from a bucket by the door, setting it over the fire to melt for broth. Every action was deliberate, quiet, and self-contained. He did not look at her, giving her the dignity of his disregard. He was offering her not comfort, which was a language neither of them knew, but something far more fundamental, safety. The fire burned bright, the water began to steam, and outside, the world was a frozen, hostile wilderness. But inside this small wooden box, a fragile truce with despair had been declared. The first days were measured in the rhythms of survival. Kalen would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to disturb the fragile peace. He would tend the fire, hunt, chop wood, his life an unchanging cycle of labor that kept the encroaching wilderness at bay. Ilara remained in her corner, a sentinel of silent suffering. Her world had shrunk to the 3 small bundles that lay before her. She fed them, cleaned them, and rocked them with a tenderness that was heartbreaking to witness. She moved as if her bones were made of glass, and her bruises slowly began to change color, shifting from an angry purple to a mottled, sickly yellow. She did not speak. He did not press her. He would leave food for her on a small stool near the hearth, a bowl of broth, a piece of roasted rabbit, a hard biscuit. Sometimes she ate it. Sometimes she didn't. He never acknowledged it either way. On the 3rd day, he brought in a length of seasoned birch wood. He sat by the fire, and with a small, sharp knife, he began to carve. The scrape of the blade on the wood was a soft, rhythmic sound that filled the heavy silence. He worked for hours, his large hands surprisingly deft. He was not making a trinket or a toy. His work had a purpose. By nightfall, he had finished 3 small, shallow cradles, their surfaces sanded smooth with a piece of rough stone. They were simple, unadorned, but they were perfectly made. He placed them one by one beside Ilara, lining them up near the warmth of the fire. He then lifted each infant, ever so gently, and settled them into their new beds. He met Ilara's gaze for a moment. Her eyes flooded with tears, but she did not cry. It was the first time he had seen anything in them other than raw fear. It was a flicker of something else, something fragile and human and achingly profound. Slowly, like a winter stream thawing under the first tentative rays of spring sun, she began to heal. The physical evidence of her ordeal faded first. The deep cuts on her face scabbed over and turned to faint, silvery lines. The bruises retreated, leaving behind only the memory of pain on her pale skin. With the fading of the marks came a change in her posture. She no longer huddled against the wall as if expecting a blow. She began to move about the small cabin, her steps initially hesitant, then more certain. She tended to the children in their new cradles, her hands steady, her movements efficient and imbued with a fierce, quiet love. One evening, as Kalen returned from checking his trap lines, weary and cold, he found a bowl of hot stew waiting for him on the small table. It was made from the rabbit he had brought in the day before, with wild roots she must have found stored in his pantry. He stopped in the doorway, surprised. She stood by the hearth, her back to him, but he saw the tension in her shoulders. He walked to the table, sat, and ate. The stew was simple, but it was hot and nourishing. When he was finished, he looked over at her. She was still not looking at him, but her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was a whisper, raspy from disuse, but it was clear. The 2 words hung in the air, momentous and powerful. They were the first she had spoken since he had taken her from Thorne's estate. Kalen merely nodded, a single, sharp dip of his chin. "You're welcome," he replied, his own voice gruff. But a shift had occurred, a silent treaty signed. She had not just made him a meal, she had made a choice. She had taken a small piece of this life and claimed it as her own. The world outside the cabin began its slow, inexorable transformation. The iron grip of winter loosened. Patches of brown earth appeared in the snow-covered clearing, and the sound of melting ice dripping from the eaves became a constant, gentle percussion. The sun lingered longer in the sky each day, its light holding a new and hopeful warmth. Inside the cabin, a similar thaw was taking place. The silence between them was no longer heavy with fear and uncertainty, but comfortable, companionable. It was a silence built of shared space and mutual respect. Ilara's presence softened the cabin's Spartan edges. She found a small loom in a dusty corner and began to repair it, her fingers remembering an old, forgotten skill. Soon, the soft clatter of the shuttle joined the sounds of the fire and the wind. She mended Kalen's worn clothes, her stitches small and neat. She learned the rhythms of his life, having a hot meal ready when he returned at dusk, keeping the fire banked just so. She was no longer a refugee, but a partner in this small, isolated world they had built. He, in turn, adapted to her and the children. He built a small partition to give her a sense of privacy. He learned to distinguish the baby's cries, one for hunger, one for comfort, one for simple fussiness. He would sometimes watch her as she sang a soft, wordless lullaby to them, her face illuminated by the firelight, and a feeling he could not name would stir in his chest. It was a quiet, powerful thing, this life they were forging, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of utter desolation. They were two solitary souls who had found an unlikely harbor in each other, and 3 new lives were the anchors holding them fast. One afternoon in late spring, when the aspens were covered in new, trembling leaves, a visitor arrived. It was Jedediah, an old trapper with a face like a weathered map and eyes that had seen too many winters. He was the only person who ever came to Kalen's remote homestead, stopping by once a year to trade news for a hot meal and a cup of whiskey. Kalen welcomed him with a quiet nod, while Ilara retreated with the children behind the new partition, her old fear momentarily resurfacing. Jedediah's eyes darted toward the partition, then back to Kalen, a question in his gaze, but he was wise enough not to ask it. He accepted the offered stew and began to talk, his voice a low rumble. He spoke of fur prices, of a mild winter, of settlements downstream. Then his tone grew more serious. "There's a darkness down in the valley, Kalen," he said, swirling the last of his stew in the bowl. "That devil Thorn. He's been telling anyone who'll listen that a savage mountain man stole his property." A woman and her whelped Kalen's jaw flexed once, tightly. He remained silent, his expression unreadable as granite. Jedediah leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "He's put a bounty on you. A rich one. Says he wants the woman back, and your head on a pike. There are greedy, desperate men who might think that bounty is worth the climb up here." He finished his meal and stood to leave. At the door, he paused and looked at Kalen, his expression grave. "You always said you just wanted to be left alone. But it seems the world ain't willing to let you." The old trapper disappeared back into the woods, leaving behind a silence that was once again charged with menace. The peace they had so carefully constructed had just been revealed for what it was: fragile, temporary, and under siege. The new settled over the cabin like a shroud. The comfortable quiet was gone, replaced by a taut, watchful tension. Kalen became a different man, the quiet homesteader receding to reveal the hardened survivor beneath. He spent his days not just hunting and chopping wood, but securing their world. He reinforced the cabin door with an iron bar. He checked the sight lines from the tree line, clearing brush that could provide cover for an approach. In the evenings, he no longer carved wood or sat in quiet contemplation. He sat by the fire sharpening the blade of his axe until it shone with a lethal light. The rhythmic scrape of wet stone on steel was a grim promise, a new nightly ritual that spoke of the violence to come. Ilara watched him, and the fear that had been dormant for months returned, cold and sharp. But this time, it was different. It was not the paralyzing terror of a helpless victim. It was the fear of a mother protecting her young, the fear of a woman who had found something worth fighting for and was terrified of losing it. One night, she came and sat across from him as he worked the stone against the blade. The children were asleep, their soft breaths the only peaceful sound in the room. She looked at his hands, strong and calloused, now preparing for conflict. She looked at his face, set and grim in the flickering firelight. "You brought this on yourself," she whispered, the words not an accusation, but a statement of fact filled with a terrible sadness. For as he stopped his work and finally met her eyes, the hardness in his expression softened for a brief instant. "He will not set foot on my land," he stated, his voice low and absolute. It was not a boast. It was a vow. In that moment, they were no longer rescuer and survivor. They were allies, bound by a common threat and a shared, unspoken pact to protect the life they had built together. The confrontation came on a grey, overcast morning. The air was still and heavy, pregnant with unspoken threat. Kalen was outside splitting logs when he saw them, 4 figures on horseback, emerging from the tree line. Thorn was at their head, his face a mask of smug vengeance. Kalen didn't run. He simply laid down his splitting maul and picked up the sharpened axe that was always leaning against the woodpile. He stood his ground in the middle of the clearing, a lone, immovable object against the coming tide. Thorn and his hired men reined in their horses a dozen yards away. "So, the thief shows his face," Thorn sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "I've come for what is mine. The woman. The brats. They are my property." Kalen's response was a low growl. "You own nothing here." As the hired men began to dismount, their hands on their weapons, the cabin door creaked open. Elara stepped out into the grey light. She did not hide. She did not cower. Her face was pale but her eyes burnt with a cold fire Thorn had never seen before. She walked across the clearing and stood beside Kalen, turning to face her former tormentor. "I am not your property," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength that stunned the men into silence. "I am not a thing to be owned. And these are my children." Thorn's face contorted in a spasm of fury. "You dare," he began, raising his hand as if to strike her from memory. But he never finished. With a guttural roar, Kalen moved, his axe a blur of motion. The fight was brutal, swift, and decisive. It was the primal fury of a man defending his home against the calculated cruelty of a tyrant. When it was over, Kalen stood panting, his knuckles raw, amidst the silent forms of Thorn's defeated men. He looked at Elara. She hadn't flinched. She stood her ground, a guardian of the life she had reclaimed. The threat was over. The past was finally, truly dead. Years passed, flowing as steadily and peacefully as the creek that now ran behind the cabin. The harsh clearing had been tamed into a homestead. A small field of corn grew in the summer sun, and a pen held a pair of goats. The cabin itself had been expanded, another room added with the same sturdy, loving care as the first. It was no longer a refuge, it was a home, filled with the sounds of life. 3 small children with their mother's dark hair and their father's serious eyes ran laughing through the meadow, their small hands clutching wildflowers. Kalen would watch them, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He taught his sons how to track, and his daughter how to read the sky. Elara was the heart of their world, her quiet strength the foundation upon which their lives were built. Her laughter was a frequent sound, a melody that had replaced the silence of old sorrows. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep purple, the family sat on the porch they had built together. Kalen was carving a small wooden bird, while Elara braided her daughter's hair. Their sons were trying to catch the last of the fireflies in a jar. Elara leaned her head against Kalen's shoulder, a gesture of easy, profound affection. He paused his carving and put his arm around her. They didn't need to speak. Everything that mattered was right here, in the warmth of a hand, the sound of their children's play, the shared peace of a sunset. They were a family forged not in law or ceremony, but in the crucible of survival and the slow, powerful alchemy of love. They were proof that even in the harshest wilderness, the most beautiful things can take root and grow. This story is a testament to the idea that true strength is not about ownership or power, but about protection and compassion. It reminds us that family can be found and forged in the most unexpected of places, and that a home is built not from wood and stone, but from courage, trust, and love. If this story of triumph over adversity moved you, subscribe to our channel for more cinematic tales that explore the depths of the human spirit. Tap the bell to be notified every time we release a new film. Your support allows us to continue telling stories that matter.